So here I am back in Montreal again, back on the east coast of Canada, and we're continuing to reflect on the question from last week is how does shooting these videos in the intimate spaces of my own home affect me? And I think it's a very good lead into this week's discussion about how Bennett is important or not important, political or not political, how the readings of Jane Bennett could or should or might affect the way that you participate in the politics of gastronomy in an ongoing way. And part of that is because as I set up for this video and I think about the lighting and I think about the way I'm dressed and I think about what I said last week and what I said this week and what you're seeing in the background behind me and even what kind of clothes I'm wearing, all of this makes me think about myself as an agent of learning or knowledge or expression of ideas or person interacting with technology. Like I said last week, I start seeing myself in these multiple ways. And I think that's where politics begins, is a perception of the self. Because from there, many things will then spin out in terms of the actions and that we do and the power that we wield during those actions or the powers that we don't wield. And so the reflexivity part is very, very important. And that's maybe a better answer to why I shoot videos in my own home, other than the fact that I don't have a professional studio and I don't have an office at a university right now. But the value in shooting these things at home is that constant attention to my own self. And while that may seem egotistical or too autobiographical, I think what it does is it helps ground and situate me for myself, but also for you. You see me as an individual in a very specific space, not in a neutralized space of academia, but in a personal space. I am human talking to other humans about ideas and things that yet other humans have written about and are expressing in an attempt to deal with the way that humans and non-humans interact with each other. And so, anyway, that's enough of the preamble. But that's, I think, something that has just come up for me as I was writing some responses to the questions that Lily emailed me this week and to apparently some of the things that you've been discussing in class. So I guess the title for this video is not why does Bennett matter? When does Bennett matter? And this is a question that I often ask myself about all the things, all the tools that I use in my life in terms of research and writing and thinking and teaching. When does something matter? So when does performativity matter was basically the last 2 pages of my own PhD dissertation. When does this thing that I have just spent the last 5 years and 200 pages on, when does it matter? And not why or how, but when, in what conditions do I want to use this particular tool? And that's the same for any critical tools. When does any critical tool that you're using matter? When do any non-critical tools matter? I have a little sort of not haiku, but version of a haiku that I wrote in response to that. Hammer is good, pound, leverage out. Tweezer is good, pinch, tease out. Laser is good, burn, excise. So not a haiku at all, but a way of thinking about all these things that are good, and they do things that are specific. But a hammer is not a tweezer, and a tweezer is not a laser, and Bennett is just another tool, as is design and performance and social network analysis and participant observation and discourse deconstruction and chemical titration and clinical drug trials. All of these are different critical, non-critical tools that are good to apply in different conditions and different situations. None is right or wrong. None produces absolute truth. And each one tells you something about the process and problems, maybe, of investigation and analysis and interpretation when you're using that tool, including your own epistemological and ontological biases. So when you observe these things that are effectively told to you during the use of a given tool, you might come to understand a little bit more about what's going on in the whole sphere that you ostensibly care about. And that includes what's going on within yourself. That includes the reflexivity part that I started this video with. I always very strongly felt in my early reading of Bennett, particularly in the early chapters, that she definitely does incorporate and build on the three ecologies. And in fact, what you have not seen yet, in chapter 8, which is called Vitality and Self-Interest, she discusses Guattari explicitly and basically says that it's this manifesto-like statement that he puts forward in the three ecologies that she, which is very much about the self-interest of humans preserving the planet on which they live. It's about building on that and creating another layer of political theory around that maybe can apply to a less human-interested focus on the preservation of the planet, but that is equally important when talking about political theory. So she absorbs Guattari into her project, builds on it, builds around it, and in some ways becomes part of the confederacy that Guattari and Spinoza and Dewey and Latour and in fact yourselves and me, we are all part of. We're now part of this confederacy of political agency or political thinking on systems, on ecologies, and on the articulations between those ecologies. And so it's intriguing to me about, for example, Lemke's rebuttal and critique of Bennett, or indeed any of the other people who have critiqued Bennett, and there have been many, is that she has a limited perspective on things political. And of course she has a limited perspective. She's an individual who has written a book. She is not the God's eye truth teller of what is political and what isn't and what needs to be attended to. All of our perspectives are political. This is, in fact, I think what Bennett shows us with this work, as well as Guattari. And that when we recognize the limited sphere of knowledge and influence of any one individual body, even though bodies aren't individual, we start becoming better practitioners in the world of ecological and political activity. So when you attend to the multiple ecological registers or the vital materiality of non-human things, it's a first step towards perceiving our own non-causal agency in the world. That is, we have agency, but we are not the direct causes of effects in the world. We are part of it. We're not powerless, but we're not omnipotent. And so if we start to sense some degree of omnipotence in a given situation, or even a degree of command or control over it, then maybe Bennett and Guattari are those little voices in our head warning us to be wary of that sense of omnipotence or power or control. And so they're also advising us to check out what else might be acting in that situation, what else might be equally or differently powerful to us. And of course, the same warning that they are giving us is that when we sense that something else, some other body or individual or institution or ecological construct is all powerful or all dominant or in charge or telling the truth with a capital T, that is also something to be wary of and to check out, what else is participating in the confederacy of agency of that particular moment. So perhaps one of the key questions or the key insights from Bennett and how all this ties back to politics is, what do you care about in terms of investigation, analysis, and interpretation? What do you care about in terms of effecting change in your close world or your larger world? Is it your career, your position in the world, your ability to make money? Is it about the rights of eaters and producers? Is it about the biogeophysical environment or the microbiome? Is it about food as an abstract concept that doesn't have any material qualities to it? Or is it about food as a traded commodity that is all about materiality but not material agency? Is it about learning? Is it about just power and money and being? Is it about enlightenment? So when you ask and answer that question, then you start to get to maybe some kind of clarity about what kind of tool you want to use when examining and intervening within those questions and within the food systems in general. So maybe this leads to this question: what is the condition you are examining, and what should the tool be? And then you know a better sense maybe of whether Bennett is the right tool for you, or some other political interpretation, or some other non-political interpretation. My use of Bennett in past has always been in this question of what else is going on here. And sometimes you don't need to ask that question. So my comparison often has been to the world of physics, which is another area of study that I have some practice with, some experience anyway. And the sort of blunt comparison I make is between classical mechanics, which describes how sort of large objects in the world, like human bodies and tables and chairs and cars, move, and how things like billiard balls can explain to us how energy and momentum are conserved and how mass is all part of this. And so it's a very kind of large-scale understanding of how bodies in the world are physically interacting with each other. And then there's quantum mechanics, which starts to describe how much, much smaller things in the world are interacting with each other. Things like atoms and electrons and light units, quanta, and all sorts of other smaller things that are much harder to measure with our fingers, how those things interact. And then even more relative is the theory of relativity and other kinds of physical relationalities that are much less easy to understand with our blunt instruments. And so we have to get to more theoretical or finer instruments, tools like tweezers and lasers. And then the next scale up or down is grand unifying theory and string theory, and trying to understand how all of the forces in the universe might be defined or described or understood through a single combined theory. At which point you start to wonder, why do we need one single combined theory? Is that necessary? Is that going to be the truth-telling tool that some people are seeking? And is that problematic? Because if you do have grand unifying theory, there's an awful lot of power invested in that theory. So there's an inherent question. Should we move towards even better and better tools? Because that might be implying that the other tools that were good should be thrown out altogether. And maybe sometimes those tools are valuable, and you don't need to worry about the bigger tools. At some point in the past, I don't remember how many videos ago, I talked about understanding transistors and how they operate in a circuit, or semiconductors and superconductors, or how a car engine operates. And again, do you need to have the tool of knowledge of how the combustion chamber is actually functioning to drive your car? No. Do you want to distract yourself with that? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. It depends whether you're a car mechanic or a bus driver, and those are different conditions in which you need different tools. So coming back to physics for a second, in say the scale of observing a block of wood sliding down an inclined surface, and this is a classic experiment to measure both gravitational forces and the coefficients of static and kinetic friction, then in that case, classical mechanics works very well as a system of both observation and analysis, and it's good. And you don't need to go to quantum mechanics, and you don't need to go to grand unifying theory to measure gravity or to understand what's going on with that block on that inclined surface. But if the scale is the insides of a superconductor, or the insides of a super collider underneath the surface of the Swiss Alps, and you are wondering about creating and observing and maybe manipulating new subatomic particles, then you do need another set of tools. And those are tools that deal with the physics of very, very tiny things that are affected by more than just gravity and friction, but also things like electromagnetic fields and nuclear bonds, and maybe even the forces or the directionalities of time, whatever that may eventually lead us to understand. So if you get to even smaller or more, lateral or wiggly things, or more complexly dimensioned scales of observation, ones that include more than just 4 dimensions, but go on to 5 and 6 and 8 dimensions, whatever, again, those might be, then maybe you need yet another set of tools that are still in the stages of theoretical development, and maybe ones that don't have practical tools or tools that allow you to directly intervene. And so this is where you get to some areas of grand unifying theory or string theory, and then maybe also political theory, and maybe also things like Bennett's vital materiality. And when you are starting to question more microcosmic or more multidimensional things, or things that we haven't even yet got a conception of how to conceive of, then it's useful to start playing around in these spaces of theoretical tool making, because it helps build on layers of knowledge for the next toolmaker and the next. And so this is where, for example, Bennett has built on and wrapped around Guattari, and maybe Guattari wraps around Bennett as well, and how Lemke might be building on and wrapping around Bennett, and how you might be wrapping on and building around me and Lemke and Lilly and all of the different people who are continuing to build and wrap around each other's theories and tools of practice. So this is where the question is she right or wrong, is a little irrelevant, but more how can you use her, how can you use us to build the next tools of theory and practice that you want to deploy in the spaces of your political agency and of your direct action within food systems. So at each scale of observation or analysis or participation, you need to say to yourself, what matters here? What's going on? So there's always going to be a political motivation of some sort. There's always some kind of power that's being traded or exchanged or pushed back and forth between different things. So a wooden block sliding down an inclined plane in a high school physics lab doesn't generally grab the attention of members of parliament. However, those objects and the way that they're articulated with textbooks and grading systems and final report cards and all of these other political elements of secondary school, those are all part of the political or power dynamic system of teachers and teenagers and schooling systems and education at a broader scale. So there's politics at play. It just isn't the stuff that's going on among those who govern our lands. So when you get, though, into the super collider scale of things, that is where, say, maybe prospective university students are getting excited and asking about applying for internships or thinking about eventual careers in research in theoretical physics or subatomic physics. But maybe the headmaster of the school doesn't really care about the super collider. They care more about the political agency of getting funding from rich parents. Super colliders, however, do get the attention of international science coalitions and the EU and transnational corporations with vested interest in future technologies. And so that always means that there are going to be members of parliament or lobbyists or governmental leaders, and then also the politics of universities and governmental defense departments and journalism. And so that's where the political gets a little bit more capital P politics. So that scale of things, yes, politics is at play in the more conventional sense. All right, so what does all this mean for gastronomy? I have often thought of, and sometimes been mocked for thinking about it this way, I've thought about gastronomy as kind of the quantum physics of food, or the quantum version of cooking and cuisine, or of gardening and farming, or of grocery shopping and composting. That yes, all of these things operate at a very observable scale that we can intervene in with relatively blunt tools. However, if we're going to start understanding the systemic and complex interrelationships of cuisine and farming and composting and food regulation and food testing and farm quotas and climate change, then maybe gastronomy starts becoming the tool that is a bit more theoretical and a bit more fine in its detail and understanding of, in quotes, subatomic food interrelationships. So I don't know what that means for molecular gastronomy. Let's not go into that for now, but maybe you can debate that in class. I don't know what the analogy for molecular gastronomy would be in terms of quantum physics, but maybe it's just some kind of deconstructionist postmodern bullshit, or maybe not. It's also, the question of taste and tools and techniques and economics in restaurants and a bunch of other things. So that's a side conversation. So let's look at some cases within gastronomy and how those cases might reveal whether Bennett is a valuable tool or not. So let's start with the condition, the space of a kitchen, which is itself composed of many subconditions and subspaces. And for example, I'm cutting up vegetables on my chopping block. You have now seen my chopping block. You have seen how it might have been used in cutting up vegetables in the past. In that case, my hands, the blade of the knife, the vegetable peeler, the surface of the wood, and then the physical structure of the carrot or the zucchini or the cauliflower or the cabbage. All of those things are participants. And at that scale of action, relatively simple culinary tools of understanding can be deployed in order to understand what happens. The vegetable peeler takes off the top layer of whatever vegetable I am preparing. The knife helps me cut it into small pieces. Then there are smaller pieces and I can eat them or do something else with them. All right, so that's a pretty straightforward scale. It doesn't really need vital materiality to describe what's going on. If I start sauteing those vegetables in a nonstick fry pan, all right, I've started to implicate electricity and gravity and a certain amount of chemical physics involved in whatever the coating is on my fry pan. There's vapors coming up. There might be smoke that's produced. There might be a smoke detector involved going off, alerting my neighbors. And so the scale of things physically has certainly gotten larger. Has it gotten more refined in terms of material agency? Well, yeah, there's a bit more traffic going on in my apartment, a few more invisible things that I don't have nearly as much control over. For example, the smoke particles that are coming up off of that fry pan that are then going into the atmosphere of my home that are being noticed by my smoke detector, which is producing a sound that is also then traveling through space and being noticed by my neighbors. So there's a bunch of things that are acting and reacting with each other that I am not technically in charge of, although I did put batteries into my smoke detector, and although humans did build the apartment structure through which the sound is traveling, but we didn't build the atmosphere that allows sound waves to move through space. What about the nonstick fry pan? Well, there's a lot of political stuff around that. Am I in charge of the politics of journalism on emissions from Teflon coatings? No. Am I in charge of my long-term absorption of those emissions and whatever carcinogenic effects they produce, and whether or not I'm feeding that to my family or letting my family smell that in the room while I'm cooking? Well, to a certain extent I'm in charge of that, and to a certain extent I'm not. How my body reacts to the carcinogenic effects is also a matter of multiple other agencies: my immune system, my genetic predisposition towards developing cancer, my proximity or distance from the direct fumes coming off the fry pan. But then also I'm not in charge of the air currents in my apartment and whether or not those fumes are coming towards my face. So there we start saying, Bennett's starting to get a little bit more intriguing and important. And if I were to take those same cut up vegetables and instead of frying them or sauteing them in the pan with heat, I was to ferment them, and I mix them with salt and water, and I put them in a jar, and I maybe add some fenugreek and some bay leaves and some chilies to that. And I seal the jar, but not too tightly, and I put it on a plate, and I leave it alone for 7 or 8 days. And I wait to see whether or not those vegetables start fermenting. Was there enough lactobacillus on them to activate the sugars in them? Is the salt amount that I've put in helping to support the growth of that positive ferment, or am I inhibiting all biological activity inside that jar because I just added too much salt? Were there pathogens present? Were there a lot of them? Were a few of them? Were they responding well or badly to the salt solution? What about the chilies? Where did they come from even? I think Thailand, but then I dried them myself. Okay, this is getting a little bit busy. This is maybe a call for Bennett, or maybe not. Maybe we can just ferment things and eat them as pickles. Or maybe we want to investigate who's doing labor in the fermentation process. And then we get into some layerings on of feminist theory and labor theory and Marxism and human domination of non-human things. And so then Bennett starts becoming much more important there, as well as a bunch of other theorists, as well as a bunch of people who have written about collaboration and written about scales of invisibility and invisible labor. Oh, that's getting into a whole new package of theory tools that we need to deploy to understand the situation. So again, blunt tools might work perfectly well for one set of objectives and motivations in making some fermented pickles, and then maybe they don't work if we're also trying to do something else with that process of fermentation, something else that goes beyond the simple process of preparing food for next week. So here I put to you a couple of other situations, and of course you can come up with many other gastronomy or food situations where you might want to deploy Bennett or not, but here are a couple of prompts. See what you want to do with them. Farmer's field or a garden. This is a wonderful space for thinking about blunt tools and finer or more specific tweezer-like tools in understanding what's going on. How much does Bennett matter when it comes to planting seedlings in a row in your backyard raised beds? How much does it matter when those seedlings are in a much larger farmer's field and they're being sprayed with pesticides? How much does it matter whether that field is part of an industrial food production system or a small-scale local food system in which people are producing food for their very local community, maybe just for their families? What happens when those foods are sold at farmers markets? What happens when those foods are sold into the industrial food chain to wholesalers that then bring the food through all sorts of different technologies and transportation systems to far distant places? So in those situations, what's going on and what's the level of observation and what are the tools of observation and analysis that you want to use? Does Bennett help? Is Bennett not so useful? Question for you to answer. Or say the context, the condition is the restaurant, another fantastic space for observing what might be going on with both blunt and more Bennett-like vital materiality tools. Is this a restaurant in which terroir appears on the menu, in which the list of ingredients is articulated with all of the points of origin of those foods, as well as the story of the farmer, as well as some other narrative about locality and seasonality? Or is it Nando's? And the restaurant menu is much more pictorial and maybe has some calorie counts, but it's really about taste and price. So where do you want to point your tools of observation in that case? What happens when you're with a bunch of friends or colleagues or new associates that you might be trying to suss out and understand, and someone takes on the role of ordering the right wine for the meal that has been collectively agreed upon? Where's the power of the agency there? Is the wine that's being ordered commercially imported from Italy? Is it locally produced? Is it biodynamic? There's a whole bunch of multiple agencies that need to be involved. Is it natural wine? Is it wine that has been left to be produced on its own? Is it a fancy label? Is it an expensive label? Does it have a screw cap or a cork? Where are the elements of the physical aspect of that wine demanding some attention from Bennett or Guattari or you? Recently, a colleague of mine has written in a given piece of text that the project she's working on will ensure sustainability within the ecosystem. And this triggered me to think once again about what humans do when it comes to wielding power over other humans, other non-human things, and the processes by which those humans and non-humans interact. And I actually corrected that language and I said, that's an oxymoron. We cannot ensure sustainability in an ecosystem. We can maybe move towards sustainability or try to move towards sustainability. We can participate within an ecosystem in ways that express the idea that sustainability is valuable. We can hope to ensure sustainability, but we cannot ensure sustainability within an ecosystem because we are part of its confederacy, but not in charge of the outcome. We are not the almighty hand that wields the absolute singular authority. And so I didn't go into that much detail when I made the word correction, but I did in advance pat myself on the back for the fermentation workshop that I have organized with my colleagues for next week. And I'm going to be doing this workshop because I think it's fun to teach people to ferment. I think it's great to have the team building results of doing something like a food workshop together. But I also think it might help us understand collectively better how ensuring sustainability is not something that humans can do. That we can participate, yes. That we can work towards, yes. But that we cannot ensure. We can ensure nothing. We certainly can't create sustainability. We can move towards it and we can participate in its support. So that's where food and something as relatively simple as a fermentation workshop can help us understand some of the political agencies that are at play within the much bigger systems that we care about when it comes to participating in gastronomy and studying about it and then eventually working within it. At the end of the article that Lemke has written in response to Bennett, he says that her vital materialism quite surprisingly results in an alternative to politics. And to me, that seems to suggest that there is one politics, the politics with a capital P. Or maybe, if not that there is something that is politics and then something that is not politics, and therefore that Bennett can create an alternative to that thing that is politics. And this is like the statement that my students have often made to me after I talk about performance and performativity, which is basically, if everything is performance, then why does performance matter? And so my response to them, and now again to you, is it comes back to this original question for this subject that you're currently studying. What is politics? Does politics have an is? And if it does, then why and when and how does it matter? Or, as is my response to my students, it doesn't matter what is politics or what is performance and what is not. It matters that we pay attention to it so that we can see the political in all things, including those things that might not immediately be considered politics because they are too macro scale. They are too much chopping up the vegetables on the chopping block or just ordering a bottle of wine or food at a restaurant. Politics and performance and performativity and political agency and vital materialism is about learning to witness, and maybe intervening within, if we have the tools for it, the relationships of power. And that starts with the self, I think, or at least it certainly involves to a very critical degree the self. So when you learn to witness and intervene within the relationships of power within your own subjective selves, within our own subjective selves, and including, all the ways that you have become you, your education, your family, your culture, the society of which you are a part and participate in constructing, your objectives and motivations, your desires, your passions, your emotions, when you witness yourself as a set of relationships of power in which all those things are at play, you become better at witnessing the power and the relationships and the dynamics around you. You are political bodies constantly, even in a room by yourself, if you're ever by yourself. There are microbes in this furniture probably in that room. But anyway, you are a political debate yourself of pulsions and of need states and of momenta and of histories and of futures. And when you are attentive to that, you've already started to be more effective and more powerful in all of the other spheres of food and power that you want to affect. I think Bennett helps us see that. I think Lemke helps us see that. I think Guattari definitely helps us see that. And so witnessing, being reflexive and understanding of what you are is a beginning step towards being reflexive and understanding about what all the other agencies in the world are and what they're doing and what they can do and how they can be participated with and within.